Cold steel clicking around a pair of wrists is a sound that echoes forever. For 20 years, she had been the one handing down the sentences, wielding the gavel, serving as the ultimate authority in the courtroom. But on a crisp Tuesday morning, standing on the concrete steps of her own courthouse, none of her accolades mattered. To the aggressive patrolman tightening the cuffs, she wasn't a legal scholar or a presiding magistrate. She was just a target. The Monroe County Courthouse was an imposing structure of limestone and granite, its massive neoclassical columns designed to make anyone standing before it feel small. For most of the city's residents, the building was a place of anxiety, a monolith where debts were collected, marriages were dissolved, and freedoms were stripped away. But for the Honorable Corinne Wallace, it was simply the office. At 46 years old, Corinne was one of the youngest women ever appointed to the Superior Court bench in the district. She was also one of the few black women to hold the position. Her journey to the bench had been paved with exhausting excellence. She had graduated near the top of her class at Georgetown Law, spent a grueling half-decade at the elite private law firm of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Megger and Flom, and then shocked her colleagues by taking a massive pay cut to become a public defender. She wanted to understand the law from the ground up, to see how it applied to the people who couldn't afford $1,000 an hour retainers. When she was finally appointed to the bench, she brought with her a reputation for being brilliantly analytical, fiercely fair, and terrifyingly quiet. Judge Wallace did not need to yell to command a room. Her silence was enough to make veteran prosecutors sweat. Despite her immense power within the building, Corinne was famously unassuming outside of it. She abhorred the pomp and circumstance that usually accompanied judicial appointments. While her colleagues drove leased Mercedes-Benzes and parked in the secured underground VIP garage, Corinne preferred the fresh air. On this particular Tuesday morning in late October, she had parked her 10-year-old Subaru Outback in a standard employee surface lot, a few blocks away. The morning air was biting. Corinne wore a plain navy peacoat over a simple grey turtleneck and dark slacks, her hair pulled back into a neat, protective style beneath a knitted beanie. Over her shoulder hung a worn leather tote bag that held a heavy stack of case files, her Apple Watch, a travel mug of black coffee, and her judicial proximity badge. She looked like any ordinary commuter, perhaps a mid-level administrator or a paralegal, bracing against the autumn wind. 2 blocks away, leaning against the hood of his black and white cruiser, Officer Gregory Halstead was already having a miserable morning. Halstead was a 14-year veteran of the city's police department, a man whose career had plateaued a decade ago. He was broad-shouldered and heavy-footed, with a thick mustache and a permanent scowl etched into his features. Over the years, Halstead had amassed a thick personnel file filled with civilian complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, insubordination, but thanks to a strong union and a string of lenient precinct captains, the complaints had always been quietly dismissed or buried. Halstead despised his current assignment. Perimeter security at the courthouse was a rookie's job, a glorified mall cop position. He was supposed to be out on the streets cracking skulls and chasing down real criminals, not watching lawyers in expensive suits rush up the courthouse steps. He was in a foul mood, nursing a lukewarm coffee and a deep-seated resentment for the world around him. At 7:45 a.m., the courthouse was just beginning to wake up. The main public entrances wouldn't open for another 15 minutes, meaning the only people legally allowed on the premises were credentialed staff. Corinne approached the building from the east side, avoiding the grand main staircase in favor of a discreet side entrance, heavily shaded by old oak trees. This was the employee annex door, accessible only by a magnetic keycard. The wind whipped violently around the corner of the building as she approached the heavy steel door. Shivering, she balanced her coffee cup on a small concrete ledge and unzipped her heavy leather tote, plunging her hands into the depths of the bag to fish out her badge. From his vantage point 50 yards away, Halstead spotted her. His eyes narrowed. The training he had received over his career should have prompted him to observe and assess. Instead, his deep-rooted biases took over instantly. He saw a black woman in casual, non-business attire lingering in the shadows of a restricted entrance to a government building. He didn't see a judge preparing for her docket. He saw a trespasser. He saw someone who, in his mind, did not belong. Halstead pushed himself off his cruiser, adjusting the heavy utility belt at his waist. He let his hand rest casually over the butt of his taser as he began a slow, deliberate march toward the East Annex. He didn't radio in his movement. In his mind, this was a simple shoo-in, a chance to exert some authority and blow off steam on someone who couldn't fight back. Corinne, entirely focused on untangling her lanyard from the spiral binding of a legal pad at the bottom of her bag, didn't hear the heavy thud of Halstead's boots on the pavement until he was less than 10 feet away. "Hey!" The bark was loud, aggressive, and designed to startle. Corinne jumped slightly, her hand freezing inside her bag. She turned her head, her breath pluming in the cold air, to see the imposing figure of the police officer closing the distance. "Can I help you, officer?" Corinne asked. Her voice was steady, polite, but lacking the subservient tremor that Halstead was accustomed to hearing from the people he stopped on the street. "Step away from the door," Halstead ordered, cutting the remaining distance until he was uncomfortably close. He loomed over her, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. Corinne frowned, genuinely confused for a fraction of a second. She glanced at the heavy steel door, then back to the officer. "I'm sorry, is there a security issue this morning? Was there an alert?" "The issue is you're loitering at a restricted entrance," Halstead sneered. "This door is for courthouse personnel only. Public entrance is around the front, and it doesn't open until 8. Move along." Corinne sighed inwardly. She was already running slightly behind schedule. She had a complex evidentiary hearing at 9 o'clock involving a massive corporate fraud case, and she needed time to review the final briefs. She didn't have time to play games with a territorial patrolman. "I am courthouse personnel, officer," Corinne said, her tone shifting slightly. The warmth evaporated, replaced by the cool, measured cadence she used when addressing a restless courtroom. "I am just trying to find my ID badge. It slipped to the bottom of my bag." She turned back to her tote and reached inside again. "I said step away from the door." Halstead's voice rose to a shout, and suddenly his hand shot out, gripping Corinne's left shoulder and jerking her backward. The sheer force of the pull caught Corinne off guard. She stumbled backward, her leather tote slipping from her shoulder and crashing to the concrete. Case files, pens, and a spare pair of reading glasses spilled across the cold ground. Her travel mug tipped over, hot black coffee pooling over the grey stone. A jolt of adrenaline spiked in Corinne's chest, but years of legal training and absolute emotional discipline kicked in instantly. She caught her balance, her dark eyes locking onto Halstead's face. "Do not touch me," Corinne said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal quiet that had made seasoned attorneys wither. "You have absolutely no legal justification to initiate physical contact." Halstead barked a harsh, mocking laugh, though he was momentarily taken aback by her vocabulary. He was used to panic, anger, or tears. He wasn't used to being reprimanded like a disobedient child. "I have every justification, lady," Halstead growled, stepping forward to invade her personal space once more. "You're trespassing on restricted government property, acting suspiciously, and reaching into a concealed bag after being given a lawful order. I don't know what you're digging for in there. For all I know, you've got a weapon. I was digging for my credentials, which you would know if you had bothered to exercise basic situational awareness Instead of jumping to prejudiced conclusions, Corinne fired back, her mind instantly cataloguing the interaction. No probable cause. No reasonable articulable suspicion under Terry v. Ohio. Unlawful detainment. Battery. "Listen, sweetheart," Halstead sneered, the patronizing term dripping with contempt. "You can use all the big college words you want. You don't look like staff. You look like you're casing the joint or waiting to harass one of the judges. Now you're going to turn around, put your hands flat against that wall, and let me do a pat-down. Then I want to see a government-issued ID." Corinne stood her ground. She was acutely aware of the danger she was in. She was a black woman facing an armed, aggressive, and clearly unstable police officer in a secluded corner of the courthouse grounds. She knew the statistics. She knew how quickly these situations turned fatal. But she was also a sitting judge of the superior court, and a profound, righteous anger was beginning to burn away her fear. "Officer, listen to me very carefully," Corinne said, enunciating every syllable with crystal clarity. "My name is Corinne Wallace. I work in this building. My credentials are in that bag on the ground. If you allow me to pick it up, I will show them to you. If you lay your hands on me again, you will be violating the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, and I promise you, the civil and professional consequences will be catastrophic for your career." Halstead's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The sheer defiance, the absolute refusal of this woman to bow to his authority infuriated him. In his mind, respect was obedience, and anything less was a threat. He didn't process her name. He didn't process her warning. He only processed the challenge to his ego. "You're refusing a lawful order," Halstead spat, his hand unsnapping the leather retention strap on his handcuffs. "It is not a lawful order," Corinne corrected him seamlessly. "You have no reasonable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. Your demand for a search is unconstitutional." "I make the law out here, lady," Halstead shouted. Without warning, he lunged forward. He grabbed Corinne's right wrist, twisting it violently behind her back. Corinne gasped in pain as her shoulder joint screamed in protest, but she forced herself to remain limp, refusing to offer even a hint of physical resistance that he could later claim was assaulting an officer. She knew the script the police union would use to defend him. She had seen it 100 times in her own courtroom. She would not give them a single thread to spin. "Officer Halstead," Corinne said, catching sight of the metal nameplate on his chest as he shoved her roughly against the cold brick wall of the annex. "Badge number 4482. I want you to note for the record that I am entirely compliant, I am unarmed, and I am not resisting." "Shut your mouth," Halstead grunted, ripping her left arm behind her back to join the right. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into Corinne's wrists. The metal teeth clicked rapidly as Halstead squeezed them shut, tightening them far past the point of necessity. The metal dug into her skin, pinching a nerve and sending a shockwave of numbness down to her fingertips. Click, click, click. The sound was sickeningly loud in the quiet morning air. Corinne closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the icy brick of the courthouse. A profound sense of surrealism washed over her. It didn't matter how many degrees she held. It didn't matter that she commanded the respect of the city's most powerful elites. In this moment, stripped of her robes and trapped in the prejudiced gaze of a bad cop, she was powerless. "You're under arrest." Halstead leaned in close, his hot, coffee-scented breath washing over the sides of her face. "For what?" Corinne asked quietly, her voice devoid of panic. "Trespassing, disorderly conduct, refusing a lawful order, and resisting arrest." Halstead rattled off the charges like a grocery list, throwing in resisting just to cover his bases. "You're going to have a very difficult time," proving any of that in a court of law, Corinne replied. Halstead grabbed the chain connecting the handcuffs and yanked upward, causing Corinne to wince sharply. "Let the judge sort that out," he sneered, utterly oblivious to the irony of his own words. "Now walk." Halstead didn't lead her to his cruiser. Protocol dictated that an arrested suspect be immediately secured in the back of a police vehicle and transported to the nearest precinct for booking. But Halstead was vindictive. He wanted to punish this woman for daring to speak to him with authority. He wanted to humiliate her. Instead of calling for transport, Halstead decided to march her around the perimeter of the building, across the expansive front plaza of the courthouse, and into the building's holding area through the public security checkpoint. It was a calculated power play, designed to parade her in front of the morning crowds. "Move!" he barked, shoving her forward. Corinne stumbled, her expensive leather bag and scattered legal documents left abandoned on the concrete. She quickly regained her footing and began to walk, holding her head high. She refused to look down. She refused to cry. As they rounded the corner of the building and stepped into the grand plaza, the wind hit them full force. It was 8:05 a.m. The plaza was rapidly filling with people. Attorneys in tailored suits clutched briefcases, pacing and talking loudly on cell phones. Clerks rushed toward the main doors holding stacks of folders. Civilians, many looking nervous and exhausted, huddled in small groups waiting for the doors to open. As Halstead marched Corinne through the center of the plaza, heads began to turn. Conversations stopped. Corinne felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the metal binding her wrists. She saw a young black mother holding a toddler, looking at her with a mixture of pity and deep, familiar fear. She saw a group of paralegals pointing and whispering. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her shoulders, the overly tight cuffs cutting off the circulation to her hands. Yet, Corinne's mind remained fiercely analytical. She was no longer just a victim of police brutality. She was a judge, evaluating a case in real time. She noted the lack of Miranda warnings, though she knew they weren't required unless he interrogated her. She noted the excessive force of the handcuffs. She noted the deliberate public humiliation, which spoke to the officer's malicious intent. Halstead strutted behind her, his chest puffed out, enjoying the attention. To the uninformed public, he was a brave officer who had just apprehended a dangerous criminal. Midway across the plaza, a second police cruiser rolled up to the curb, its tires squealing slightly. The door popped open, and a young rookie officer stepped out. Officer Timothy Barnes, fresh out of the academy, jogged over to them. "Hey, Greg," Barnes called out, looking slightly out of breath. "I saw you walking from the perimeter. Everything okay? Need transport?" Halstead paused, yanking Corinne to a halt. "Nah, I got it under control, Timmy. Just caught this one trying to sneak into the employee annex. Refused to show ID, got combative, tried to resist." Officer Barnes looked at the woman in handcuffs. He frowned, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. The woman didn't look combative. She wasn't fighting, screaming or crying like most suspects. She was standing perfectly straight, her posture commanding and composed. She was dressed neatly, and despite the wind messing up her hair, she radiated an aura of intense authority. Barnes met Corinne's eyes, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Her gaze wasn't fearful. It was sharp, calculating, and piercingly intelligent. "Ma'am?" Barnes asked hesitantly, ignoring Halstead for a moment. "Are you okay? Are the cuffs too tight?" "Don't talk to her, Barnes," Halstead snapped, annoyed by the rookie's empathy. "She's a trespasser. Thinks she's smarter than us because she knows a couple of legal buzzwords. I'm taking her down to holding. Let her cool off in a cell before I book her." Corinne looked at Barnes. "Officer," she said softly, her voice carrying easily over the wind. "I highly recommend you ask your partner to look at the credentials left in the brown leather tote bag by the East Annex door. It would save the city a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Halstead yanked her chain again. "Shut up. Let's go." Barnes stood on the plaza, watching his senior officer march the woman toward the grand, sweeping steps of the courthouse. The unease in Barnes's gut blossomed into full-blown panic. There was something terribly fundamentally wrong with this picture. He quickly jogged back to his cruiser, got in, and threw it in reverse, heading toward the East Annex to find the bag she had mentioned. Meanwhile, Halstead forced Corinne up the wide limestone steps of the main entrance. "You're about to see how the real world works," Halstead muttered into her ear as they approached the heavy glass doors. "You think you can disrespect a badge? You're going to be sitting in a concrete box with the rest of the garbage in about 2 minutes. Corinne didn't respond. She just kept walking. They entered the bustling vestibule of the courthouse. Just past the revolving doors was the main security checkpoint, a bottleneck of metal detectors, X-ray machines, and armed court bailiffs whose job was to screen everyone entering the building. The checkpoint was currently manned by head bailiff Thomas Croft, a massive, imposing man who had worked at the courthouse for 25 years. Croft was beloved by the judges and feared by the defendants. He knew everyone in the building by name, face, and voice. As Halstead shoved Corinne through the revolving doors, she stumbled slightly on the rubber matting. "Move it!" Halstead commanded, pushing her toward the security line. "Make way! Officer coming through!" he shouted to the civilians, parting the crowd like the Red Sea. Halstead marched her right up to the metal detectors, expecting the bailiffs to open the bypass gate for him, so he could drag his prize down to the holding cells in the basement. "Hey, Croft," Halstead called out casually to the head bailiff, who was currently inspecting a lawyer's briefcase. "Got a live one for the holding pens. Trespassing and resisting. Open the gate." Thomas Croft closed the briefcase and looked up. He expected to see a belligerent drunk or a frantic shoplifter. Instead, his eyes locked onto the small, handcuffed woman standing in front of Officer Halstead. Croft froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him ashen. His jaw went slack, and for a full 3 seconds, the bustling, noisy courthouse vestibule seemed to lose all its sound. He stared at the woman, then at the metal cuffs biting into her wrists, and then at the smug, arrogant face of Officer Halstead. "Good morning, Thomas," Judge Corinne Wallace said quietly. Her voice sliced through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room like a scalpel. Judge Wallace?" Croft stammered, his voice cracking loudly in the cavernous hall. The title echoed off the marble walls. Judge Wallace. Behind Halstead, the murmur of the crowd instantly died. The attorneys in the security line froze. The other bailiffs stepped back, their hands hovering near their radios, their eyes wide with absolute horror. Halstead's smug smile faltered, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at Croft, then down at the woman he was gripping like a common criminal. "What did you just call her?" Halstead asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small and very, very uncertain. "What did you just call her?" Halstead asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small and very, very uncertain. Head bailiff Thomas Croft did not answer the patrolman. His eyes remained locked on Corinne, his face a mask of absolute disbelief. The bustling, chaotic energy of the Monroe County Courthouse vestibule had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, static silence. The only sound was the hum of the X-ray machine belt running empty. "Judge Wallace," Croft repeated, his voice dropping into a harsh, urgent whisper as he stepped completely out from behind the magnetometer station. "Your Honor, are you... What is happening here?" The color rapidly drained from Gregory Halstead's face, leaving him a sickly, mottled gray. His brain, heavily conditioned by years of unchecked authority and ingrained prejudice, struggled to process the information. Judge? This woman wasn't a judge. Judges were old white men with silver hair and golf club memberships. Judges didn't wear beanies and walk around the side entrances. "Croft, what kind of joke is this?" Halstead stammered, his grip on the handcuff chain instinctively loosening. "She's a trespasser. She was loitering at the East Annex. She refused a lawful—" "Take them off," Croft commanded. It wasn't a request. The head bailiff, a man who usually treated the city's police officers with jovial camaraderie, stepped into Halstead's personal space. Croft was 3 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier than the patrolman, and the sheer fury radiating from him was palpable. "Take the cuffs off her right now, Halstead, or so help me God, I will draw my sidearm and arrest you for kidnapping." A collective gasp rippled through the frozen crowd of attorneys and civilians. Armed bailiffs at the secondary screening stations immediately unsnapped their holsters, their postures shifting from relaxed administration to high-alert tactical response. They didn't know the full story, but they knew one thing. A city-beat cop had their presiding judge in irons. Halstead's hands began to tremble. The sheer magnitude of his error was finally piercing the thick armor of his arrogance. "She didn't have ID," he pleaded, his voice cracking, looking around desperately for an ally and finding none. "She refused to comply. I was doing my job." "Officer Halstead," Corinne said. Her voice was not loud, but in the dead silence of the lobby, it carried with the concussive force of a gavel strike. Halstead flinched, looking down at the woman he was holding. "You did not ask for my ID," Corinne stated, her tone icy, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. "You commanded me to step away from the door. You initiated unlawful physical contact. You threw my bag to the ground, and you ignored my explicit statement of my identity. You then escalated to excessive force without probable cause. Now, you are going to remove these handcuffs." Slowly. Halstead swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing its way down his temple. His fingers, suddenly feeling like thick, useless sausages, fumbled with the key hooked to his utility belt. He inserted the small metal key into the keyhole of the right cuff. His hand shook so violently he could barely turn it. Click. The right cuff sprang open. Corinne brought her arm forward, wincing internally as a sharp, tearing pain shot through her rotator cuff. But she did not let a single grimace cross her face. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. Click. The left cuff released. Corinne rubbed her raw, deeply indented wrists. The metal had bitten so hard into her skin that a thin line of broken capillaries had formed a dark purple ring around both arms. "Your Honor, do you need medical?" Croft asked, stepping between Corinne and Halstead, effectively shielding her from the officer. "I am fine, Thomas. Thank you," Corinne said, rolling her shoulders to check her mobility. She turned her dark, unyielding gaze back to Halstead, who looked like he was about to vomit. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the courthouse flew open, and a breathless Officer Timothy Barnes burst into the lobby. In his right hand, he clutched Corinne's worn leather tote bag, now stained with spilled coffee. In his left hand, held up high like a white flag of surrender, was a gold-plated judicial proximity badge encased in clear plastic. "Greg!" Barnes yelled across the lobby, completely oblivious to the radioactive tension in the room. "Greg, let her go! I found her bag! The ID is in here! She really is a judge!" Barnes pushed through the frozen crowd, coming to a dead halt as he saw the scene. Halstead standing pale and trembling, the cuffs dangling empty from his hand, and the head bailiff glaring at him with lethal intent. Barnes looked at the badge in his hand. The bold black lettering screamed back at him, "Honorable Corinne Wallace, Superior Court Magistrate." "Oh, God," Barnes whispered, letting the bag drop to the floor. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Within 5 minutes, the courthouse lobby was sealed off to the public. Within 10, Chief Judge Harrison Caldwell, a formidable 70-year-old jurist with zero tolerance for police misconduct, was marching down the marble staircase from his chambers, flanked by the courthouse's chief of security. By the time Captain David Miller, the commander of the 4th Precinct, arrived on the scene, the situation had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding. It was a full-blown constitutional crisis. Captain Miller was a pragmatist, a man who spent half his career trying to clean up the messes left by old-school, aggressive cops like Halstead. As he walked into the holding area where Halstead had been temporarily detained by the bailiffs, Miller looked like he had aged 5 years on the drive over. "Tell me you didn't do it, Greg," Miller said, his voice flat, exhausted. "Tell me you didn't assault a sitting judge of the Superior Court on the steps of her own building." Halstead sat on a metal bench, his head in his hands. His badge and service weapon had already been confiscated by Croft. "Captain, she was out of uniform. She looked like she was loitering at the restricted entrance. I approached her, told her to move. She gave me attitude. She reached into her bag. I had to secure the scene." "You secured a federal magistrate!" Miller exploded, his composure shattering. "She's the presiding judge on the multi-million-dollar State vs. Omnicorp fraud trial. The woman has security clearance higher than the mayor, and you put her in a joint lock. She refused a lawful order," Halstead fired back, desperation making him cling to his union-approved defense scripts. "She didn't comply. If she had just complied, none of this would have happened." "She tried to comply, you idiot," a cold voice echoed from the doorway. Captain Miller and Halstead both looked up. Corinne stood in the doorway, flanked by Chief Judge Caldwell. She had retrieved her bag, brushed the dirt from her peacoat, and looked as composed as if she were about to order a morning tea. Only the faint, purple bruising peeking out from beneath her grey turtleneck cuffs gave away the violence of the morning. "I explicitly informed you that my credentials were in my bag," Corinne said, stepping into the room. "You chose to ignore my compliance because it didn't look like the submission you demanded. You wanted me terrified. You wanted me subservient. When I offered you legal facts instead of fear, your ego could not handle it." Halstead stood up, his face flushing red again. "You were acting suspicious. Any officer would have made the stop. Any competent officer would have conducted a Terry stop lawfully, assessing the situation without escalating to immediate, unprovoked physical violence," Corinne retorted effortlessly, her legal mind dissecting his defense in real time. "You lacked reasonable, articulable suspicion. You lacked probable cause for arrest. You bypassed procedural safeguards because you made a snap judgment based on my race and my gender. You looked at me, and you didn't see a citizen entitled to constitutional protections. You saw a target." "That's a lie!" Halstead shouted. "We'll see," Chief Judge Caldwell interrupted, his deep baritone rumbling through the small room. "Captain Miller, as of this moment, Officer Halstead is barred from entering this courthouse in any capacity. Furthermore, I have already contacted District Attorney Robert Kensington. A formal investigation into civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and assault under color of law is being opened." Captain Miller nodded grimly. "He's suspended, Your Honor. Unpaid. Pending a full internal and external review." "Good," Caldwell said. He turned to Corinne, his stern expression softening slightly. "Corinne, I've cleared your docket for this day. Go to the hospital, document the injuries, go home." Corinne looked at the Chief Judge, then at Halstead. She saw the simmering resentment in the patrolman's eyes. Even now, facing the destruction of his career, Halstead didn't feel remorse. He only felt victimized. He believed he was the one being wronged by the system. Corinne knew that if she went home, if she hid away, the narrative would shift. The police union would leak stories about a combative judge. They would spin it as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an arrogant legal elite. "No, Harrison," Corinne said firmly, adjusting her coat. "I have a 9 o'clock evidentiary hearing on the Omnicorp docket. There are 50 lawyers in this building, billing $1,000 an hour waiting for my rulings. I am not letting a prejudiced patrolman disrupt the administration of justice." Caldwell frowned. "Are you sure? Your wrists?" "My mind is perfectly fine," Corinne said, "and my mind is what commands my courtroom. I will take the bench at 9. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Halstead staring after her, the reality of his absolute ruin finally settling in like a concrete block on his chest. News of the incident leaked before the lunch recess. By noon, it wasn't just local news, it was a firestorm. The security camera footage from the plaza, which captured Halstead violently yanking Corinne around the building and parading her in cuffs, was subpoenaed by the district attorney's office and immediately leaked to the press by an anonymous source within the precinct. The optics were devastating. The video showed a calm, compliant black woman being physically manhandled and marched like a trophy by a heavily armed, aggressive white police officer. The fact that the victim was one of the most respected legal minds in the state turned a routine case of police overreach into a national scandal. Behind closed doors, the city's power brokers were in full panic mode. The president of the Police Benevolent Association, Frank Delano, called an emergency meeting with the mayor and the chief of police. Delano was a ruthless negotiator, famous for burying civilian complaints and keeping bad cops on the street. But even Delano knew this was a losing hand. "We need to settle this quietly, and we need to do it today," Delano barked, pacing the mayor's office. "If Judge Wallace files a 1983 civil rights lawsuit, she'll open up the precinct's entire history of racial profiling complaints during discovery. She'll subpoena a decade of Halstead's records. We offer her a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement, a public apology from the department, and we force Halstead into early retirement with his pension. Clean break. You think Corinne Wallace cares about your money?" District Attorney Robert Kensington, who was sitting in the corner of the office, scoffed. "Frank, you don't know this woman. She left a $4 million partnership track at Skadden to work as a public defender for $60,000 a year." "You can't buy her silence," Delano sneered. "Everyone has a price." They didn't have to wait long to find out. At 4:00 p.m. that same day, after adjourning her complex corporate fraud hearing without missing a single legal beat, Judge Corinne Wallace held a press conference on the exact spot in the plaza where she had been paraded in handcuffs just 8 hours earlier. She stood before a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. She wasn't wearing her judicial robes. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. The dark bruising on her wrists was intentionally left visible, stark against her skin. "This morning, I was unlawfully detained, assaulted, and falsely arrested by an officer sworn to protect this city," Corinne began, her voice ringing clear and steady over the plaza. "I was targeted because I didn't fit an officer's prejudiced profile of what a judge looks like. I was treated as a threat because I asserted my constitutional rights." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy over the reporters. "Many have reached out to me today, suggesting that this was a misunderstanding or a training error. It was neither. It was a deliberate exercise of unchecked power," Corinne continued, her eyes finding the camera lenses. "Representatives of the city and the police union have already offered me a substantial financial settlement on the condition of a non-disclosure agreement. They want this to go away." A murmur of shock rippled through the press corps. Revealing settlement offers during a live press conference was highly irregular, a brazen, scorched earth tactic. "I am officially declining their offer," Corinne announced, her voice unwavering. I am not accepting a single dime of taxpayer money to cover up the systemic failures of the police department. I will not sign a non-disclosure agreement. Instead, I have retained independent civil rights counsel, and we will be filing a comprehensive federal lawsuit against Officer Gregory Halstead, Captain David Miller, and the city itself. The reporters erupted into shouted questions, but Corinne raised a hand, silencing them instantly with the same authority she used in her courtroom. "This lawsuit is not seeking financial damages for myself," she clarified, delivering the final, devastating twist. "We are seeking a federal consent decree. We are demanding a complete, independent federal overhaul of the 4th Precinct's training, hiring, and disciplinary protocols. Officer Halstead's personnel file, which contains over a dozen buried complaints of racial profiling and excessive force, will be unsealed and entered into the public record." She looked directly into the center camera, her expression fierce and unyielding. If a sitting judge can be assaulted on the steps of the courthouse, then the single mother walking home from her shift is not safe. The teenager waiting for the bus is not safe. The badge is a shield for the public, not a weapon for the prejudiced. I intend to use every ounce of the law to ensure this city remembers the difference. Corinne stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of questions, and walked back into the courthouse, flanked by state troopers. The war had officially begun, and Officer Halstead, sitting in his living room watching the broadcast, finally realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't just handcuffed a judge. He had handcuffed the one woman who had the power, the intellect, and the iron will to tear his entire corrupt world down to the studs. The legal machine that Judge Corinne Wallace unleashed upon the 4th Precinct was a masterpiece of tactical precision. She did not just hire a local attorney, she retained Arthur Pendleton, a legendary civil rights litigator and former senior partner at the powerhouse firm Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Pendleton was a shark in a bespoke suit, a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling corrupt municipal departments across the eastern seaboard. When Pendleton formally filed the Section 1983 civil rights lawsuit in federal court, he didn't just name Officer Gregory Halstead. He filed a monel claim against the city, arguing that the police department's unwritten policies and failure to train officers directly caused the constitutional violations. This allowed Pendleton's team to bypass the protections of qualified immunity that usually shielded individual officers. The discovery phase was a bloodbath. Frank Delano and the Police Benevolent Association threw millions of dollars into high-priced defense firms, filing endless motions to quash Pendleton's subpoenas. They argued that unsealing Halstead's past disciplinary records would violate his privacy and jeopardize past convictions. But they were arguing in front of Federal District Judge William Davies, a no-nonsense jurist who had closely followed Corinne's career. Davies summarily denied every defense motion, ordering the precinct to turn over a decade of internal communications, disciplinary files, and dispatch logs. As the boxes of documents flooded into Pendleton's war room, the true horror of the 4th Precinct's culture came to light. Halstead wasn't an anomaly. He was the standard. Pendleton's paralegals uncovered a staggering pattern. For years, Captain Miller had been systematically burying civilian complaints involving racial profiling and excessive force. Halstead alone had 19 formal complaints against him, all from Black and Hispanic residents, all alleging unwarranted physical violence during routine stops. Every single one had been dismissed by internal affairs as unfounded or lacking corroborating evidence. But the real twist, the one that would shatter the precinct entirely, came from inside the house. 2 months into the litigation, on a rainy Tuesday evening, a young man walked into the lobby of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He was out of uniform, wearing a faded hoodie, looking over his shoulder with paranoid intensity. It was Officer Timothy Barnes, the rookie who had found Corinne's bag on that fateful morning. Barnes had not slept a full night since the incident. The image of the dignified judge in handcuffs, juxtaposed against the casual, gleeful cruelty of his senior officer, had fractured his conscience. He had joined the force to help people, but for the past month he had been subjected to intense, quiet intimidation from the older cops, warned to keep his mouth shut and remember who his family is. Sitting in Pendleton's corner office, with Corinne Wallace listening in via a secure conference line, Barnes broke the blue wall of silence. "It's not just Halstead," Barnes told Pendleton, his voice shaking as he slid a thick, encrypted flash drive across the mahogany desk. "They have a private WhatsApp group. They call it the Overtime Club. Halstead, Captain Miller, and about 20 other veterans. They use it to coordinate unconstitutional stops. They share photos of people they've harassed. They brag about it. And Delano knows." Pendleton plugged the drive into an air-gapped laptop. As the chat logs populated the screen, the veteran lawyer's blood ran cold. It was worse than he could have ever imagined. The messages were filled with racial slurs, explicit agreements to target minority neighborhoods to hit arrest quotas, and a running tally of how many complaints they could rack up without getting fired. In one chilling exchange dated a week before Corinne's arrest, Halstead had messaged the group, "Gonna go shake the trees at the courthouse perimeter next week. Let's remind the suits who actually runs this city. Officer Barnes." Corinne's voice crackled through the speakerphone, calm but laced with profound gravity. "By giving us this, your career in that precinct is over. They will come after you." "I know, Your Honor," Barnes replied, wiping a tear from his eye. "But if I don't do this, my soul is over. I can't wear the same badge as him." The following morning, Pendleton filed the WhatsApp logs into the public federal court docket as Exhibit 4A. The resulting explosion leveled the city's political landscape. Within hours of the logs going public, the mayor held a frantic, televised address, announcing the immediate resignation of the chief of police and the firing of Captain David Miller. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which had been monitoring the case, officially announced they were taking over. Frank Delano, realizing that defending Halstead would now mean federal conspiracy charges for the union leadership, did the one thing Halstead never saw coming. Delano cut him loose. The union withdrew its legal funding, citing a breach of their internal conduct clauses. Overnight, Officer Gregory Halstead went from being the untouchable alpha of the precinct to an isolated, bankrupt pariah, facing the full, terrifying weight of the United States federal government alone. 6 months later, the federal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. The air was thick with tension, the gallery filled with national press, civil rights advocates, and dozens of citizens who had previously been victimized by the 4th Precinct. At the defense table sat Gregory Halstead. He was unrecognizable from the broad-shouldered, arrogant patrolman who had strutted across the courthouse plaza. He had lost 20 pounds. His suit hung loosely on his frame, his hair was thinning, and his hands possessed a permanent, nervous tremor. Without the union, without his badge, and without his gun, he was just a frightened, broken man facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. Because of the overwhelming evidence provided by Officer Barnes, Halstead had been indicted on federal criminal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law. Facing 20 years in federal prison, his public defender had begged for a plea deal. The DOJ had agreed, on one condition. Judge Corinne Wallace had to approve it. Corinne sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed not in a suit, but in her flowing, black judicial robes. It was a potent visual reminder to everyone in the room, and to Halstead, of exactly who he had tried to destroy. Judge William Davies looked down from the bench, his expression stern. "Mr. Halstead, You have agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of felony deprivation of civil rights. The plea agreement recommends a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, followed by lifetime disbarment from any law enforcement or private security profession. Do you understand these terms? Yes, Your Honor, Halstead croaked. His voice was a pathetic whisper, entirely stripped of its former bluster. Before I accept this plea, the victim has requested to make a statement, Judge Davies said, nodding respectfully to the gallery. Judge Wallace, the floor is yours. Corinne stood. The silence in the massive courtroom was absolute. She didn't walk to the victim's podium. Instead, she stood exactly where she was, forcing Halstead to turn around and look her in the eye. Halstead flinched as their eyes met. He couldn't hold her gaze, dropping his eyes to the floor. Look at me, Mr. Halstead, Corinne commanded. The lethal quiet of her voice sent a shiver through the room. It was the voice of a magistrate, a woman who wielded the law like a scalpel. Slowly, agonizingly, Halstead raised his head. When you put those handcuffs on me, you told me I was about to see how the real world works, Corinne said smoothly, her words echoing off the oak-paneled walls. You believed that power was derived from violence, intimidation, and a piece of metal pinned to your chest. You believed that the law was whatever you decided it was on the street. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. But you were wrong. The real world is not governed by bullies who hide behind badges. The real world is governed by accountability. It is governed by the United States Constitution. You looked at a black woman standing outside a courthouse and saw a target. You assumed I was voiceless. You assumed I was powerless. And in your arrogance, you handed me the hammer to shatter your entire corrupt institution. Halstead began to weep silently, the tears tracking through the deep lines on his face. I am not speaking to you today as a victim, Corinne continued, her voice rising in power, carrying the weight of history. I am speaking to you as a representative of the justice system you spent 14 years mocking. Your precinct is currently under a federal consent decree. Your captain has been indicted. Your union is under federal investigation. And the officers you trained are currently being retrained under a curriculum supervised by my legal team. Corinne looked up at Judge Davies. Your Honor, the prosecution's recommendation of 7 years is acceptable. Let his sentence serve as a permanent precedent. The era of unchecked authority in this city is over. Judge Davies nodded slowly. Statement noted. Mr. Halstead, I accept your plea. You are hereby remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals. As the federal marshals approached Halstead, pulling his arms behind his back, the metallic click, click, click of the handcuffs echoed through the courtroom. It was the exact same sound Corinne had heard on the freezing concrete steps months ago. But this time the steel was binding the right wrists. Halstead was led away, his head bowed, the heavy doors of the courtroom closing behind him with a resonant thud. Corinne Wallace did not smile. She did not celebrate. The victory was profound, but the cost to the community over the decades had been too high for joy. She turned and walked out of the federal building, the flashbulbs of the press erupting around her like a thunderstorm. The next morning, at exactly 8:45 a.m., Corinne Wallace pulled her old Subaru Outback into the employee lot of the Monroe County Courthouse. She wore a simple beige trench coat and her worn leather tote bag over her shoulder. She walked toward the East Annex door, the autumn sun finally breaking through the clouds. At the door stood Officer Timothy Barnes. He was no longer a city beat cop. He had been transferred to the elite courthouse security detail, hand-picked by head bailiff Thomas Croft. Barnes stood up straight as Corinne approached, offering a crisp, respectful nod. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Good morning, Officer Barnes," Corinne replied warmly. She reached into her bag, pulled out her proximity badge, and swiped it against the reader. The heavy steel door clicked open. Corinne stepped inside, walked up to her chambers, and put on her robes. There was a docket waiting, attorneys murmuring in her courtroom, and the law to uphold. She ascended the steps to the bench, sat in her high-backed leather chair, and picked up her wooden gavel. The Honourable Corinne Wallace struck the sounding block, the sharp crack silencing the room instantly. "Court is now in session," she said, and the real work began. What an absolute masterclass in justice. Judge Corinne Wallace didn't just fight back. She completely dismantled a corrupt system from the inside out and made sure Officer Halstead faced the ultimate karma. If this story made your blood pump and proved that nobody is above the law, smash that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant legal takedown, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next real-life drama. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Judge Wallace's shoes? See you in the next one.